again, thank you for having me here this afternoon. My name is Ponti. I'm a freelance journalist from Manchester up near Augusta, and I also host and produce a history podcast called Historia Monarchia. And I'll be up front, that's not Latin. It was just a fun play on words that I came up with to mean unearthing history's lost and untold stories, because there are so many of them. But I have had a couple of Latin professors that I've sat down and spoken with, and those who have majored in the classics actually rolled their eyes at me for being so presumptuous in my name choice. They're just baffled I would choose this name, even though it was just a fun play on words. And they say Latin is dead. I beg to differ. So today I'll be sharing with you how podcasts are digging up our forgotten past and breathing new life into history. But before we begin, I do have some questions for you. Has anyone here heard of Sequoia? Just raise your hand if anybody has heard of Sequoia. Okay, anybody else?
Depends on the context.
Well, you know, trees would be one, but this is a different kind of sequoia. Back in the early 1900s, Sequoia was proposed as a state. It is now considered by some historians to be a lost state that was originally named after the inventor of the Cherokee writing system. Now, 5 Native American tribes came forward in the early 1900s, and they wanted to secure statehood. Let me see this. Okay. They wanted to secure statehood before the government came in and declared Indian Territory a state. They had already walked the Trail of Tears, as you know. They walked with blacks, both freedmen and slaves, to this vast, unknown terrain, this Indian Territory as it became known. And more of this terrain was being opened up for white settlement. And they saw what was coming. They were nervous. They wanted to secure some of this region as their home that they had made over the decades since walking the Trail of Tears. So they proposed the state of Sequoia. In 1905, the Sequoia Convention was held, and I think something like 55,000 Native Americans, single state representatives, and others voted, and they overwhelmingly voted in favor of making Sequoia a state. So the Native American leaders, with their legal representatives, they had followed all rules and guidelines set forth before them. They went before the U.S. Congress. They already had it mapped out according to what was asked of them. They already had a state seal. They went before the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Congress, they did this. They would not conceive of it. They would not hear it. They would not consider it. Now, back then, there was no ACLU. There was no hashtag movement that could help propel this issue into the spotlight. Sequoia just, it went away. There was nothing that they could do to push this forward. And so some historians today consider it to be a lost state. Now imagine how different things might be if this actually had become a state of its own. Okay, let's stay in the same time period. Has anyone here heard of the Rufus Buck Gang? Now, I was just having a conversation with my father-in-law about this because he's never heard of them. Has anyone here heard of the Rufus Buck Gang? Rufus Buck? Okay, let's try something different. Has anyone here heard of Jesse James or Billy the Kid? Yeah. Well, of course, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, whose real name is Bob, by the way. You might know this being a genealogist person. And I'm speaking with his great-great-nephew this week for a new episode I'm doing. They're household names. They have been popularized by Hollywood and in literature. We have come to idolize these Old West outlaws, some of who did some really pretty horrible things. But the Rufus Buck Gang, you're not going to find them in any textbooks. You're not going to really find much if you were to go online and search for them. There's very little known about the Rufus Buck Gang, but they have a lot of significance. Now, Rufus Buck was 17 or 18 years old. One day, he gathered his friends in the late 1800s, 4 other boys, and they formed this Rufus Buck Gang. And they were between the ages of 13 and it's either 17 or 18. Rufus Buck was the elder. And it was around the same time when more whites were moving into Indian Territory, and Native Americans, blacks, were becoming a little bit nervous about what was going on. And he gathered his friends and said, we need to stop this. We need to do something. Now, anyone sitting here, any rational person would say, what are 4 or 5 young boys going to do against the government? And of course, pretty much nothing. But that didn't stop them. They went on a 13-day, very bloody, very flawed rebellion. They committed some heinous crimes, crimes that were already being committed in Indian territory by blacks, Native Americans, and whites alike. So they were replicating some of the things that they had already seen and experienced in their own lives. And their goal was to instill fear. That was their goal. We want to instill fear in whites, and maybe they'll leave. We want to send a message to the government, and maybe they'll hear. Maybe they'll see that this is not right. They were finally apprehended, arrested, tried twice, because the first time it didn't go through, tried twice and hanged for their crimes. Now you might say, why is this significant? 4 or 5 young boys? Okay, so they had an uprising, didn't work out. It's significant because some historians believe that this uprising, actually, the government did get nervous. It caused a bit of a media spectacle. If you dig a little bit deeper into newspapers.com, if you have access to that and whatnot, you'll find that it received a lot of media coverage. It was negative coverage, but word also spread beyond Indian territory and got back to the government. And this movement of theirs most likely helped push the government to make Indian and Oklahoma territories as the state of Oklahoma. It helped push them because they were nervous. If these 4 or 5 young boys can rise up, what if more rise up? What if these Native American leaders come together and form some kind of army and say, we've had enough? And so it likely pushed the US government in their actions. Yet you never hear about the Rufus Buck Gang. I mean, they thought they were doing the right thing. If you go in and you read some of the articles and whatnot, these boys really thought they were doing the right thing. They wanted to see justice, and they were just replicating things that they had seen, and it was a wrong approach. And in the end, they paid for their crimes. But the next time you think of Jesse James and good old Bob, please remember the Rufus Buck Gang as well. Now let's go a little bit further back. Has anyone here heard of Alice Young? And I'm really excited about this one. Okay, so Alice Young's name first appeared in the Matthew Grant diary. If you don't know who Matthew Grant is, he was the first record keeper and surveyor of the town of Windsor, Connecticut. Windsor being one of the original English settlements in the New World. Now in there, it said Alice Young, 1 blank of Windsor. And, oh, I'm sorry, there's Rufus Buck, there's Alice. So it said 1 blank of Windsor, and it was an actual blank, as you can imagine. And next to it, it listed the date that she was hanged, and it said it was for the crime of witchcraft. Now, this diary was found by a young boy not so long ago, believe it or not, either behind a church or under a church where they were doing some digging. And when he found this diary, he said, these names sound familiar. This looks like something important. So he brought it to his dad, and it's a really good thing he did because it was an important diary. This was the first time we learned that Alice Young existed. When we think of the witch trials in America, and this is about the time of year that we start thinking about that, we automatically think of Salem as being ground zero. Alice Young was convicted and hanged 45 years before the Salem witch trials ever happened. And it wasn't just her. There were a dozen other, mostly women, some men, who were convicted of this crime, and eventually they were hanged. So Alice has had her good name restored in the town of Windsor, along with another woman by the name of Lydia Smith, thanks to the efforts of Beth Caruso, who is a local Windsor author. And also a number of Alice's descendants learned about their great-great-great-great-grandmother and wanted to come to her defense. They wanted to see her actually be acknowledged and to have her good name restored. And so the town of Windsor did do that a few years ago. They honored that. But unfortunately, there's still no memorial. There's still no monument, anything in their honor to remember these victims. And that's what they're working on now in Windsor. And Beth and others are raising funds, and they're kind of really pushing this effort. Because in Salem you'll find these monuments and these memorials that pay tribute. So Alice Young, 45 years before Salem witch trials ever happened, here was this woman, first person ever, convicted of witch crimes and hanged in America. And we didn't even know her name for centuries. So she's a pretty important person. in American history. Now let's do one more and then I'll get on with things. Let's go really far back in time. Let's go back to when monks were considered the original Xerox machines. Now Xerox, if you don't know, is synonymous with a photocopier. Back in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, you didn't have any of these machines that you could stand in front of, place a book, and they'd magically spit out pages. Back then, monks were the people primarily responsible for writing and duplicating books. If you can imagine, they would sit there for hours, dipping their quill pens and writing and dipping. I mean, a book took hours, days, months, years to create these books. And these were no ordinary books. These were knowledge vessels. These weren't your run-of-the-mill romance novels that you could prop up on your knee at night while reading in bed. I mean, these were huge, glorious books that contained encyclopedias, dictionaries, atlases, whatever they were sharing knowledge with at the time, they were in there. There's one book that stands out amongst all these books. Has anyone here heard of the Codex Gigas? This is the Codex Gigas. It is considered to be the oldest and largest surviving European illuminated manuscript. We don't know when it was written, we don't know who wrote it. We believe it was a monk, and we believe it was sometime around the 12th century that this book was written. This book now resides in the Library of Sweden, and this book is big. This book weighs 165 pounds, the size of an average person. Can you imagine a book surviving all these centuries? From like the 12th century, you couldn't have gone to a castle and looted this book, put it in your back pocket and run. This was a coordinated effort. This took a team to get this book out of wherever it originally was and where it passed through all of these years, and it eventually ended up at the Library of Sweden. Now you might be sitting here saying, okay, its age, its size, that must make it pretty special. But there's actually one other aspect about this book that truly makes it unique. There's a single page inside this book that has earned it the alternative name, the Devil's Bible. As you can see here, on that page, there is a depiction of the devil himself. He's this crouched beast with fangs and claws, wearing a loincloth, and we 100% know that it is the devil based on the inscriptions that are in there. Now, why is this significant? For those of you who are religious or who understand and have studied the Bible, you know that the devil only appeared a few times in the Bible. He was a minor character. He was basically a nobody. Over the centuries, he's become the very embodiment of evil, the Prince of Darkness, the one we fear. But back then, not so much. Yet you have this book from, we think, the 12th century, featuring an entire page devoted to the devil, and we don't know why. One legend says that the monk was under a pretty tight deadline. When he realized he was not going to finish this book in time, he actually reached out to the devil and said, hey, can you give me a hand? And the devil said, sure. They finished the book in time, and to kind of show his gratitude, he dedicated a whole page to the devil. Now, is it hogwash? Well, we believe it's probably hogwash. That never happened. But here's this book with a page of the devil. We don't know why. I often have to think about it. What if we found more supporting documents or evidence that told us why he was in this really important book? Would it change our understanding of religion? Would it help us understand better why we're here today? We just don't know. So with the exception of Sequoia, I've covered each of these little bits of lost, unknown, forgotten history in my podcast, Historiam Unearthia. And these are the types of history that I really love. I've always been kind of a history geek, and it began in childhood. I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s, and back then all of my friends, they had pictures of the Care Bears and Strawberry Shortcake hanging all over their walls. As we progressed to the teen years, that became whatever popular bands we were listening to at the time, or whatever music we loved at the time. But not me. My room was different. It was often called an abomination. I spent hours, I was a recluse, I spent hours in my bedroom when I was a child cutting pages from National Geographic, newspaper articles, atlases, gazetteers. I mean, my room was just filled with pages, and I would tape those all over my room. I had some on my door. I even had some on my ceiling, much to the dismay of my mother, who was just livid that I would hang anything on the walls, period. But that was my childhood, was really around history. My bookshelves, you could find the occasional Judy Blume or Beverly Cleary, but you have to look close. I had encyclopedias, of course. I had historical biographies and novels. I had, of course, Nat Geos, but my room was pretty much, if you walked in, you knew I loved history. I loved history so much, I wanted to become a historian. Now, you gotta remember, this was the late 70s, early 80s. Back then, I was told that history was a field primarily reserved for men. Now, I don't want to make this political, this isn't what it's about. I mean, that was just the truth. Back then it was, and that was accepted. That's changing, which is wonderful. And I was also told there was no money to be made in history. Why would I ever go down that road? And so I listened to them. You know, I did. I was a kid. What else would you do back then? I listened to my elders, and I chose a different career path. And if you can believe it, I chose writing. As anyone knows, there are very few J.K. Rowlings and Stephen Kings out there. But I love writing, and I noticed a shift. About 5 years ago, people were reading less print material, less newspapers, less magazines. As you know, many iconic magazines have gone out of publication, sadly. It's heartbreaking. People, you know, they claim they're busier, they're socially connected, they're just not doing the types of things that I experienced when I was a child, and others have experienced, and they're going more towards video and audio content. And so I panicked a bit because I make my livelihood in print, and I wondered, how am I going to stay relevant? And so I took a look at YouTube, which is primarily video, started to explore, and realized that I didn't want to be under the microscope all the time. That wasn't for me. Most days are actually bad hair days for me, and I'll admit that. I have 2 little kids, I'm running around, I don't usually do my hair, so I don't want to be under the microscope. I also realized that the tech aspects to producing video footage and editing it were pretty time consuming and probably a little bit over my head and what I wanted to learn. So I went over to the audio side of things, and I started to explore this world of podcasting. And I fell in love instantly. My first foray into podcasting was true crime podcasts, because who doesn't love a great whodunit story? And I was instantly transported back to my childhood, sitting in my grandmother's farmhouse in her kitchen. We would turn the radio on because there were no TVs in her farmhouse, and there never was. We would turn that radio on, put on a Red Sox game, and you would have to hear the game. You weren't watching the plays. You weren't seeing things unfold or being confused by all these images and then, you know, sponsorships and ads every few minutes. You were taking in the announcers' excitement and their disappointment. You would hear the crack of the ball as Carlton Fisk hit a home run out of the park. And you would hear the cheers of the crowd, and it was just such a rich experience, feeling that audio and having to create it in your mind, that I thought, this is for me. I poked around a bit with audio dramas, and then I discovered there are actually history podcasts. And that was the final straw. That's what I wanted to do. And I knew it was something that I could do based on my research. Now, if you're wondering what the heck a podcast is, think of it like getting in your car and turning on AM frequency and listening to your favorite talk radio show. Podcasts kind of work the same way. They're internet radio shows. You're listening to them over the internet, online. And if you're wondering who's listening to podcasts, are people really listening to these when they can watch video and get more rich experiences, or so-called, as I like to say, rich experiences? And this guy's got it wrong. I mean, obviously, one of them isn't listening to podcasts, but the answer is it's on the rise. In fact, according to the latest statistics, 44% of the US population has listened to a podcast. 44%. 50% of all homes in the United States are podcast fans. That's like 60 million homes are podcast fans. Now, if you haven't made it into this world yet of podcasting, that's okay. It's never too late to get started. And it's simple. It really is an easy thing to get into. There are two ways that you can actually listen to a podcast. The first is going directly to a website, and that's called streaming. And when you go to that website, you can either go to a podcast website or you can use a third-party service that hosts podcast, and you can listen to podcasts that way. For example, my podcast is at historiumunearthia.com. If you go there, you go up to the top and there's a little episodes link. You click that, find the episode that interests you, click the little forward arrow button. It looks just like the play button on a VCR or DVD player. Hit that, and right then and there you're listening to the show. Now that does require, again, an internet connection and a connected device, whether that be your smartphone, a laptop, an iPad. The second way that you can listen to a podcast is you can download episodes. Now downloading is convenient because once you've downloaded an episode of a podcast, you don't need an internet connection. So if you're in a home, like it would be my grandmother's home today without Wi-Fi, and you've downloaded an episode, you can still listen to it. Now there are a variety, and this is my website here, where you can, again, the episode link is up here, you can click on to find the different episodes. But there are a variety of services, apps, and websites that you can use to listen to podcasts. Some popular ones are Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio. If you are an Apple user, if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you already have an app on your device called Apple Podcast. If you find that on your device, you double-click it. You can browse by category or search for a specific show that interests you. Now, if you're an Android user, and here's where you would search if you were an Apple user. You can browse. This is the iTunes platform, kind of the home page for searching and finding podcasts that you want to listen to. Now, if you're an Android user, Google just came out with their own version of a podcast app called Google Podcast. You can load that onto your connected device, and it works the same way. You can search for a podcast that you might be interested in, or you can, again, browse by category, and I hope most of you here would be browsing for history. Now, you can listen to podcasts anywhere. You can listen to them in your car. You can listen to them sitting in your recliner at home on a Sunday afternoon, while at the beach. Most podcasts are free. And again, once you subscribe and you download these episodes, they're already stored on your phone. You get alerted when a new episode comes out of a favorite show, so you can listen to those immediately. And this brings us to the world of podcasting and history and what really excites me about this new medium. I typically refer to podcasting and history as this perfect union. Historically, history has kind of been kept in this silo. It has been mainly taught in an educational setting, in classrooms, colleges, and there's usually a standard teaching curriculum, or there has been up until the internet has become quite mainstream. And only so much can fit into these textbooks that are used in these teaching curriculums. And historically, these books were written by small groups of people. Oftentimes, there are voices left out of these textbooks or not included when these textbooks are created. Native Americans are a good example. Women, for a long time, have not been included in creating these textbooks. Of course, that's changed now. But historically, you had these textbooks that were handed down through classrooms, and sometimes they were handed down for decades without ever being updated. Podcasting has taken this silo of history and kind of blown the top off of it. What podcasting does, which differs from print or creating a textbooks, is podcasting is a quick, easy, and efficient medium for getting information into a form that you can listen to, and listen to relatively quickly. Podcasters like myself, journalists, historians, sociologists, archaeologists, anthropologists, even the average history buff, are creating podcasts around all these lost, untold, forgotten pieces of history. And it's really broadening and bringing history back to life. No longer are we getting a single perspective or a very siloed presentation of an event, person, idea, or place. Here's podcasts coming in, and every day there's 1,000 more new podcast episodes out there about history, presenting new narratives, bringing new voices to the table. So you're learning much more about a historical event than we ever had in the past. Now, another great aspect about podcasts in history is oral history. Oral history is typically passed down generation to generation. And oral history is every bit as important as written history. It's those stories that grandma tells you, or that your aunt or your mother might tell you were passed down to her about somebody witnessing a historical event. Maybe it was a civil rights movement. And those are passed down, but they're not being passed down as much as they once were. We're just not doing that anymore. And so oral history, some of these stories, some of these first-hand, second-hand accounts are becoming lost. They're gone forever. When they stop getting passed down, this oral history is gone. The nice thing about podcast is that rather than trying to get some of this oral history put into textbooks, which is a really hard prospect, or rather than having to go a book route to have like a memoir printed that might only reach a certain subset, people like myself are bringing these people who have oral history to share onto our shows. We're sitting down with them. I usually do my interviews over the phone, and they are telling us these bits and pieces of history that could become lost. And what's really wonderful is they're being stored and archived in an audio format, and they're no longer being lost. Hopefully these pieces of audio will be around, forever. Another area where podcasting and history really forms this great union is history contains a lot of personal artifacts, personal journals, diaries, letters from war, historical documents. All of those make up our collective history and help us learn more about our past. And again, many of these personal artifacts are kept within families. They are passed down generation to generation. Sometimes, unfortunately, they end up in an attic. They're put out at a yard sale. Someone buys it and then throws it away. Imagine if Matthew Grant's diary, imagine if this little boy had found this diary and he had thought, this just looks like a piece of junk, and thrown it in the backyard. Can you imagine we would never know that Alice Young existed? It is so critical that these documents in organizations like this, at the local level, often preserve many of these pieces of personal history and these artifacts. But oftentimes they are just lost, destroyed. And that's, again, where podcasting comes in. I can take a piece of personal history, a diary, and I can read it. I can record it. Then I can publish it. Anybody can go to my podcast website or a third-party service. They can discover this, and they can hear this written document, this written personal artifact. No longer do we have to rely on getting this into a textbook or book format. There it is, and it's convenient because you can listen to these podcast episodes anywhere. So history really is, podcasting really is breathing new life into a subject that has long been called boring and rigid. Now I know most of you here would disagree with that, and I disagree with that. But if you ask a kid today, what is your favorite subject in school? You're going to hear ridiculous answers like recess, lunch, chemistry. I get to blow things up. My son would say something like that. We got to put this and it exploded, and that's exciting. You rarely hear them say history. Now, podcasts are now being used in classrooms to expand the narrative, to teach more about an event. And when these kids are listening, you can see it. They are taking this in and they are feeling it. It's like watching a great movie, but without all these images to cloud what you're taking in. So podcasting and history is just this remarkable and perfect union. So when you leave here today, I hope you'll try to listen to a history podcast. Start with mine. historiamonearthia.com. There's some shameless self-promotion. I've done some episodes on Maine. I've done some episodes on New England. I've done national and international pieces of history. I most recently did a piece on Matthias Corvinus, who was found to be a Hungarian king from the 14th century who actually formed a friendship with Dracula, Vlad III. We think of Vlad III as being out there just committing all these crimes ongoing for like a few decades. He was actually imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus for 10 years. So while we think he's out doing bad things, here he is in a dungeon. And he forms this magnificent relationship with this Hungarian king. And we never knew about this until very recently. And it's just starting to get out there. So I really hope you take the time and listen to a history podcast. And with that, I will say thank you once again for having me here today. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but I'm not a historian. I just need to get that out there. I bring experts onto my show that share the facts with me. I approach each of my episodes from a journalistic perspective. So if you have questions, I'm happy to. Yeah.
What's the average length of one of your podcasts?
My podcasts run 35 to 45 minutes. Now, I did some testing when I first started to see if a shorter podcast episode would resonate better or a longer one. Believe it or not, people actually want the longer ones. You know, they say 60 minutes is a sweet spot for a podcast episode, but I try to keep mine between 35 and 40 minutes. Recently, they've been a little bit over that. But yeah, usually 35, 40 minutes. And again, the sweet spot seems to be that hour. Yeah.
What kind of equipment do you need to start doing your own podcasts?
You know, you can get really fancy, or you can do what I did and do it on a shoestring. Because again, I wasn't starting a podcast to make money, to start a side business. I need to stay relevant. You know, I'm not getting any younger here, and my, livelihood is still in print. But if we're going to continue to shift to more audio and video content, I need to stay relevant. So I went the shoestring route because I didn't know for sure if it would work out. And I bought a headset, a Sony, $75 on Amazon, a headset and a microphone. I actually invested a little bit more in a Blue Yeti microphone. I think I got that at Best Buy for something like $450. But you don't have to invest that amount of money. You can get just a basic microphone for $50. And you can get, and I got a cheap headset. My son kept telling me, no, you want to get Beats. I don't even know what Beats means. So I ignored him, and I did my own research, got a headset, $75 on Amazon. You also need to have software. I use open exchange software called Audacity, A-U-D-A-C-I-T-Y. Easy to use. There's also GarageBand that you can use. There are paid editing software for podcasts that you can use as well. But I have not yet gone that route because, again, this is not a money thing for me with podcasts. I've always loved history. I'm able to dive further in like I used to do when I was a child, and hopefully this will help me if things continue to shift. I can start, presenting audio, stories to the public as well. And I'm just kind of showing you, these are some of my favorite history podcasts. And I was actually honored this year as one of the top history podcasts of 2018 alongside Mike Rowe's The Way I Heard It and Darren Carlin's Hardcore History. Mike has yet to send me a congratulatory tweet or email. I'm not holding my breath at this point, but he's supposed to be a really nice guy. But it was quite an honor. This has been really quite a fascinating journey, an eye-opening journey. Is it time-consuming? Oh, it's time-consuming, but I have learned so much, and I really, I love sharing these bits of history with people, and I love talking to historians and archaeologists and getting all the facts from them too. So. Yeah.
So do you do all the voices yourself? Do you bring in readers sometimes, or do you mix it up a little bit?
I do. It's mostly myself right now because I am a shoestring operation. My husband often answers questions for me, and he has a script in front of him. I like to ask, have you ever heard of so-and-so? And I like to hear from people if they have. If they have, great. If they haven't. I have had some people come on and read a few things for me. But in each of my episodes, you will hear from actual historians, recorded conversations that we've had. Historians, archaeologists, sociologists, authors. I have a lot of people that have, gone in and researched for years an event or a person, like Alice Young. I first discovered her when Beth Caruso from the town of Windsor sent me an email and say, hey, listen, we discovered this woman. She's pretty fascinating, pretty important, and I really need help getting the word out there. I think this would make a fascinating episode for your podcast. And it was like, oh my goodness, this is perfect. And so she came on the show and she talked about her research and her journey discovering Alice and talking to her descendants. And I had Alice's descendants come on as well and explain to me how it felt to learn of an ancestor that had been convicted of witchcraft and actually hanged for this crime. And they shared that first moment of learning that and how surreal it was and how much it hurt that this had happened, and they didn't even know that it had happened. So I think somebody over here had a question. Does somebody over here have a question?
I did have one. Do you advertise in other words, we went on your website. Is there advertising? You make any money off this at all? Is it just all your time?
All my time right
Well,
now.
thank you.
My goal, hopefully, many of these podcasters do in audio advertising. That's how they make money. They have sponsors that come on. I may do that at some point. I'm not ready. I don't feel I've been around long enough, and I don't feel, in a position yet to offer that. But my goal with this, again, is that I've learned enough about podcasting and audio that if things keep shifting, if I have to do, I've written for New York Times, the Washington Post, if I have to do an audio story because they no longer want print from me, I'm comfortable enough that I can say, sure, I can do that for you. I'm comfortable enough that I can go and I can interview people if that has to happen, whatever it might be. But I'm also hoping that this podcast will help with books. I'd like to print a few books, and I have an agent that is actually interested, but he wants me to continue to grow and see where things go, and that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Can we go back to the state of Sequoia?
Yeah.
The boundaries on that map you showed us, it is the northern part of the state of Maine before Daniel Webster, right?
Oh, no. Sequoia would be the state of Oklahoma.
There you go.
The state of
But
Oklahoma.
if you look at that, and then some of the marks you had on there look like the present state of Maine.
Oh, no kidding. I'll have to go back and look at that. But no, that was what happened was early 1900s.
I missed that, you see.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have turned this up.
I thought you was doing a very good job.
Oh, well, thank you so much. But what happened was Indian and Oklahoma
I'm glad to
territories.
find out that.
Yeah.
I know that back in the early 70s or 80s, the state of Maine bought out the Indians in the northern part of the state.
Yeah.
And if you look at those borders, it can remind you of the state of Maine.
I'm going to go back and look at it closer. Yeah.
Sorry to be so stupid.
Oh my God, no. This is all about the conversation and about learning. And, we're never too old to learn. And that's what I keep saying to everybody. There's so much about your history, our history, we still don't know. We still don't know about, like, Matthias Corvinus being best friends with Dracula. Who would have ever thought that Dracula would have any friends at all? I mean, he's not the first guy I would turn to and say, hey, let's strike up a conversation here. But he did have a friend.
Check that out sometime.
I will do that. Thank you so very much. Does anyone have? Yes.
I'm reading a book now. Let me rephrase that. I'm trying to finish a book now which fascinates me. It's The Empire of Cotton. And I had no idea how cotton, the whole thing started, and what a big influence it was on this country for bringing in slaves, pushing the Indians out, and moving cotton, keeping going west. And now my question is, who's making the cotton fabric now?
Dare I say China?
I mean, this,
I I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I mean,
I
you know,
hope to
manufacturers.
I hope to finish the book
I
before
hope
it's
so.
due again.
Do you know the name of the book? Is it called The
It's
Empire?
The Empire of Cotton, something history.
Okay.
The Empire of Cotton, and how much it influenced the whole world. I'm,
And it did.
it's more
It
than I
did.
can grasp, really.
I've done a few episodes
And I'm only
on.
up to the early 1800s, and it said, the early 1800s were when we had this influx of cotton growing in the United States and shipping from here to England, which they were the people who were the ones that had their hands in everything and how it worked.
Right.
The whole thing is, you know, these people came together, and where did it all start? And the difference in cotton and how they spun it, and how these people in England worked these ungodly hours, these young kids, up to 13 hours a day
Oh my
with
goodness.
2 breaks. I mean,
It's hard to believe.
and how so who's making it now? That's my question.
It's a good
Would that be
question.
something that you would tackle, that you would?
It would be, but again, it would be something that each of my episodes I spend, and I mean, it sounds crazy because I don't make any money doing this, but I spend anywhere between a month and I'm still actually researching an episode that I started 18 months ago that I haven't produced yet, believe it or not. When I was digging around World War II, I discovered these rumor clinics that were set up during World War II to help dispel morale-damaging gossip in the American public. And as I dug around in that time period, I discovered, with the help, I formed a friendship. There you go, I formed a friendship. Wasn't Dracula, but it was a woman at the Library of Congress by the name of Judith. Her and I are best friends. I adore this woman because when I need something, I can write to her and say, do you guys have anything that might be down in the archives? Do you have anything that might be relevant? And she is just right there. I don't even have to go to the Library of Congress. She's willing to help me out. And as she was digging around, she goes, you know, I found something really interesting. So I found some documents pertaining to the Council of Democracy. The Council of Democracy. I had never heard of it. And she goes, it sounds like a conspiracy. And I said, what? So she sent me all of this stuff, and I started reading. I thought, whoa, this sounds suspicious here, and there's not a lot about it. I mean, I'm sure there's more, we just haven't dug. But it's one that I had started about 18 months ago, and when I have time, and I still do have blips of time here, I will go back and I will research more, or send her an email and say, hey Judith, did you find anything else? I mean, this poor woman is down in the archives digging in boxes that typically you have to go there and photocopy these yourself, but they're just, I don't think people give librarians, you know, we're here at a library, and these people at the Library of Congress enough credit. They are willing to help you find anything. And they will spend ungodly hours searching for you because that's, you know, that's also what kind of inspires and what they're passionate about as well. So yes, that is something that I would cover in my podcast, and I would end up, you know, speaking to historians familiar with cotton growing in slavery.
Mighty long podcast.
But it could be one that's a multi-episode that could have 3 or 4, you know, broken up into 3 or 4 segments too. I haven't done that yet because I've been trying to stay within a certain time frame. But yeah. Anyone else have questions? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.